Hello everyone and welcome to Green Magic, your source for all things green and magic. Alright, so this will be episode 8 of the Ramp series. This is about putting into play extra lands. So I want to establish right out of the gate that the difference between this one and part 1 of the series where you get lands is, even though both of them are about putting extra lands into play, this one is all from your hand. You're not tutoring them out of the library. So they don't have the card advantage that tutoring them out of your library would get you, but they aren't necessarily as vulnerable to search your library effects, whether it be the that stupid bird that says you can only look at the top 4, or the black demon thing that says whenever you search your library you take 10 damage or whatever stupid effect. Not really thing. Even Mind Sensor was the bird. Not necessarily something that you would build a deck thinking about unless you're in a very small play group and you just see those effects so often that you're traumatized by it. But what I think make these cards all stand out for their value is that if you're playing a kind of deck where you're just drawing a ton of cards, obviously sometimes you're going to draw a ton of lands, and by the normal rules of Magic, you're only allowed to play 1 per turn. So all those extra lands you drew, you're not getting any value of. If you got 7 lands in your hand, sure, you theoretically have your next 7 land drops lined up, assuming that you have no maximum hand size or whatever, but that's not really something that you're going to feel good about. And especially if you don't have no max hand size and you have to discard 5 or 6 cards, maybe 3 of them are lands, 2 of them are spells, that doesn't feel good. You're hurting yourself. So these are cards that I think, for the most part, will be better if you're in a deck that has really good card draw, so that you can make use out of the extra lands that you happen to draw. There are other benefits to them too. Particularly, there's a few of them that are very low on the mana curve and can get you off to a fast start. And we're actually going to start with a couple of those. Arboreal Grazer. It's 1 mana. It's a green. It's a 0/3 beast. It has reach, and when it enters the battlefield, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. Then there's Elvish Pioneer. It's a single mana, green. 1/1 Elf Druid. When it enters the battlefield, you may put a basic land card from your hand into play tapped. So, one of them is an Elf Druid, so it has good tribal synergy. It belongs to a strong tribe. The other one has reach. The elf is a 1/1, which could be okay, good, bad, whatever, for the purposes of Wild Pair. The Arboreal Grazer is a 0/3, so it's a different total power toughness, which could be relevant for Wild Pair. The fact that if you have no other synergies there, but you just are looking at a potential blocker, the Grazer has a bigger toughness with reach, so it is a better blocker in theory. The main thing that's different about them, though, is that the Arboreal Grazer lets you put any land card from your hand into play tapped. The Elvish Pioneer requires it to be a basic. So, if you, for example, on turn 1, play a basic, cast one of these, then you could put your land that would normally enter tapped in with Arboreal Grazer. That way, on turn 2, the first time you would use it, it's ready to be untapped. If it's Elvish Pioneer, then you'd have to put a basic in, and then you, on turn 2, play your tapped land, and you won't get benefit from that tapped land till turn 3. So the main reason why that would matter to me in most cases is if at the beginning of my turn, we'll say turn 5, 6, 7, wherever in the middle of the game, you play a land at the beginning of the turn, you cast one, you have some draw effects, and then you draw something like, for me, a Nykthos. Then it's like, well, I really want to get that into play. Even if I can't use it right away, I want to get that into play, and Arboreal Grazer will allow me to do that, whereas Elvish Pioneer won't. Still, though, they both they both go in the same types of decks. ETB decks, decks where you're just looking to ramp out fast and early, and 1-drops are a good way to do that. They're both very good cards, and they're both, but particularly the Arboreal Grazer I like a little bit better. They're both very important in like my ETB deck, and some of the strongest creatures in that. Next are going to be some non-permanents that will allow us to get extra lands into play. Starting with Explore, 2 mana, including a single green. This one's a sorcery. You may play an additional land this turn, and draw a card. This one was featured in the card draw series because it just lets you draw a card for free, no other benefit. This is one that I don't play very often because I just don't. As card draw, drawing 1 card is not enough for me to really justify its position. My card draw, I want to be capable of drawing me 3, 5, 10, 20 cards. You know, I want serious card draw. I don't want to mess around with a cantrip effect. Then there's Journey of Discovery, 3 mana, including a single green, sorcery. Choose one, search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal them and put them into your hand, then shuffle your library. Or you may play up to 2 additional lands this turn, and it has Entwine for 3 mana, including a single green. This one was featured in the first video of this series for the ability to, you know, search out 2 lands out of your library and then put them into play. And as pretty sure I pointed out in that video, and I'll definitely point it out now, you get 2 basics out of your library. The 2 cards you play for turn don't have to be those same 2. So if you happen to already have 2 better non-basic lands, you can just get those 2 basic lands to your hand for later and then play the other non-basic lands. And then Summer Bloom, 2 mana, including a single green. It's a sorcery. Take up to 3 target lands from your hand and put them into play. Now the wording on that one, the original one, makes it sound like you put those lands into play right then, but it is just you may play up to 3 additional lands that turn. And that was one of the things that I thought about Explore at first too, was that it required you to put the land into play as you cast it. So that was one more reason that I just misinterpreted it for a while and was less favorable towards it. All of these I think make sense if you're doing like a Spellslinger deck, if you're trying to avoid a lot of permanents. For me, I have a Wort deck, and for that one, being able to copy, you tap 2 creatures to copy instants and sorceries, so these not only fall into the card type category that would go into that, but also it helps me to ramp and draw cards, and through the course of drawing too many cards, I'll obviously, like I already mentioned, have 8, 10 lands in hand, and I just need to get rid of them, and ramping while I do it is much better than discarding them during my end step. Overall, I'm not a huge advocate for any of these cards in most decks, but in the right decks, they're very useful. And for me, Explore is very good in Wart. Summer Bloom is good in both Wart and also, well, another card, a commander that we'll get to in a little while. But any deck where you care about landfall triggers, you can get your landfall creatures out, and then, after that, they don't have summoning sickness, or depending on what the benefit is, play 3 extra lands and get those landfall triggers. Next, we're going to talk about the creatures that tap to allow you to play an extra land. Starting with Llanowar Scout, 2 mana, including a single green. 1/3 Elf Scout, tap it. You may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Then there's Walking Atlas, 2 mana, 1/1. I believe it's an artifact construct, but it is a colorless card, and I'm pretty sure it's artifact. Tap, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Then there's Skyshroud Ranger, a single mana, it's green. 1/1, it's an elf. You may put a land card from your hand into play. Play this ability only anytime you could play a sorcery. So this one does have a restriction. And then there's Sakura-Tribe Scout, 1 mana, it's a green. 1/1 Snake Shaman Scout. Tap. You may put a land card from your hand into play. Finally, there's Budoka Gardener. 2 mana, including a single green. 2/1 Tap. You may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. If you control 10 or more lands, flip it. Then the bottom half of it is Dokai Weaver of Life. Costs 6 mana, including double green. Tap it. Create an XX green elemental creature token where X is the number of lands you control. So, where to begin with all of these? Well, we'll start with the Skyshroud Ranger because he says you can only do it whenever you play a sorcery. So with some of these, you could wait till the end step of another player and then do it right before your turn. So you hold them up as blockers, or you kind of bluff that you don't have extra lands in your hand. Usually, though, I'll just want to put the lands into play right away and use them for whatever effect I might have. So that's not usually super relevant. The Walking Atlas can be helpful because it's colorless. If you have any kind of effects that, if you're just unable to produce colored mana, that can be a little bit relevant, which in at least one deck for me is somewhat relevant. The Budoka Gardener has both an upside and a downside. So if you don't have a land in your hand, but you got a bunch in the battlefield, you could tap him just to flip him, and at that point he is then capable of being a token generator of big creatures. If you want the tokens, if you want big creatures, you'll be happy to flip them over. I don't think I've ever used that ability or cared to. I know occasionally opponents will look at that and be like, uh-oh, I got to worry about big elementals coming soon. And that's not in my game plan for any of the decks that I include this card, personally. So, to me, it's kind of a downside, because if I have 10 or more lands in play, and I have a land in hand, and I want to tap him to put that land into play, I can, but from that point forward, he doesn't do that effect anymore, and that's the effect that I would include him in the deck for. But you could obviously include him in a deck for his other effect if you care more about the token generating side, and the main side is just like a nuisance to get to that. All of these are, to me, pretty good and effective in creature-based decks because they are very cheap. They're only 1 or 2 mana. They are things that you can get out early. So if you get one of these guys on turn 1 or 2, then on turn 3 you can ramp a little bit if you got the lands in hand. And then as the game goes on, once you have your big card draw engines on, if you have something like a Guardian Project and then you play one of these guys, you'll draw a card off of it, so it's advantageous to have this type of effect rather than necessarily having a bunch of sorceries that get you lands. But if you already have them out and your card draw engine, is something that draws you 10 cards or 5 cards, like a draw for every creature you have or draw for your biggest creature or something like that, you get a bunch of lands in your hand, and then you can use these abilities to start putting those into play so that you don't have to discard. You can keep your turn going and play more stuff and ramp in the process. I definitely like them if you're going for a creature heavy deck. I think that they're pretty effective, and I think that if you aren't currently playing them, you might be surprised at the utility that they add. But they complement greatly decks that have very, very good card draw engines. If you feel like your card draw engine is top notch, then you might want to also throw these in to just make your deck even better. So next are the things that will allow you to just play another land for turn. Starting with Exploration, the classic. It costs a single mana, which is green. It's an enchantment, and you may play an additional land each turn. There's Dryad of the Elysian Grove, 3 mana, including a single green. This is a 2/4 enchantment creature. It's a nymph. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. And then also, lands you control are every basic land type in addition to their other types. Next is Oracle of Daya, 4 mana, including a single green. 2/2 Elf Shaman. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. Play with the top card of your library revealed. You may play the top card of your library if it's a land card. Wayward Swordtooth, 3 mana, including a single green. 5/5 dinosaur. It has Ascend, meaning if you control 10 or more permanents, you get the city's blessing for the rest of the game. You may play an additional land on each of your turns, but Wayward Swordtooth, can't attack or block unless you have the city's blessing. And then the last one, Gaia's Touch, 2 mana, both of which are green. You may play one additional land during each of your turns, but that land must be a basic forest. You may sacrifice this to add double green to your mana pool. So Explore is the classic. It's the one that I assume most people would be familiar with for having this general effect, and it's definitely a great turn 1 play. If you don't have excessive card draw or just a great engine going so that you can play an additional land during each turn, I don't think it's that good then. I think that a lot of people in just a normal casual game without good synergy will play this on turn 1, get that second land out. Maybe on turn 2, they'll get 2 lands out. They'll have 4 lands and then this. And then they may just miss their land drops on turn 3, 4, 5, 6. So they ramp temporarily, but then they lose their advantage pretty quickly. So if you don't have extra benefits, I don't think it's that great of a card. But if you do have the great card draw engine, if you've got probably a good number of lands in your deck, if you're playing landfall stuff, it's obviously great. I think it does see a good amount of CDH play because for their purposes, getting that one extra, just getting your lands out earlier, even if it doesn't get you extra lands, is worth it for them. Dryad of the Elysian Grove, it's a creature and an enchantment, so it's a little bit more vulnerable to removal. It does have the benefit of making your lands tap for any color, basically, which I know when this card first came out, people basically said it was exploration plus something else stapled together. I forget what other enchantment allows you to. I'm pretty sure there's 2 or 3 enchantments that do this, but that allow you to have your lands be every basic land type. But for me, that second half isn't super relevant, and it's just, as a creature, it can draw you cards. If you have, the Guardian Products out as an enchantment, it can draw you cards if you're playing an Enchantress deck. For a basic deck, though, same problem as Exploration. If you're not drawing a ton of cards to where you need to play extra lands, if you don't have landfall synergies, it's not going to do very much good for you. And yeah, and because this one's 3 mana, you're not even going to get that turn 1 benefit off of it. So I do think that these cards are overplayed and overrated just because people don't necessarily play them the way that they probably should. Next is a card that I absolutely hate, Oracle of Moldaya. I already mentioned what it costs. I do not like this card at all, and I think it is hands down one of the most overrated cards. When it's considered, the fact that it's considered a staple and something that people, like the Command Zone and the Professor, when they advocate this card as for reprints and needing reprints and being one of those cards that they hope come out in that Commander Green thing later this year, I don't get that. This card, I just don't see why people value it, because it has the downside of making you play with the top card of your library revealed, which means for the entirety of the game, your opponents, if you have a board wipe coming, on top, they see it and they can work around it. If you've got your big scary Avenger of Zendikar, Craterhoof, whatever, they see it, they know it's coming, they can prepare for it. Giving away what your future plans will be is way worse than whatever benefit you get from being able to play an additional land, and if you happen to have a land on top of your library, play that. And in best case scenario, the top 2 cards of your library each turn are both lands. You play those, you get 2 card advantage per turn. Yeah, okay, sure. I got better ways to generate card advantage and ramp than this without revealing what I'm up to. I value this, the privacy and secrecy of my hand. So I don't like this card, and for how much it costs, I don't see it as being worth it to run in most decks. A landfall deck or something like that, sure, if there's specific instances, or if you're playing a deck that is full of effects that make you play the top card of your library revealed, then having one more that happens to ramp you or whatever, then is not as bad in that. If you're already like all in on the I'm going to play with the top card of my library revealed, then the downside's not really, you're already all in on that. The Wayward Swordtooth, I think that this one sees as much play as it does because its power toughness is greater than its casting cost. So it makes sense in like a Galta deck, which also is a dinosaur. So if you're going dinosaur tribal, but because it's cheaper than what its power toughness is, it can help speed up, you getting to Galta. I can imagine it kind of being used for its ramp ability. The downside is not a huge downside, but I don't see this as being a card where I would just include it for generic value. I don't think that it really qualifies as a, what would you call that, just green good stuff. I don't think that this is good enough to just go as good stuff. I mean, it kind of is. It kind of goes in that category, but yeah, should not probably see as much play as it does. And then the Gaia's Touch. This one could just be used as like a battery where you pay 2 mana into it, and then on a 2 mana that you don't need, and then on a future turn where you need 2 extra mana, use it, sacrifice it that way. So say you play this on turn 2, then on turn 3 you play your land. Now if you decide to sacrifice this, have access to 5 mana, because you'd have 3 lands and then sacrifice this. So you could have like that one-time effect of like a mini, well, not quite a mini guy, not quite a mini Black Lotus, because it only produces 2 and it costs 2 to cast, but kind of, I guess. The thing worth pointing out on this is that the extra land you play has to be a basic forest, so that is kind of a restriction that's not necessarily great, and not also necessarily a huge deal in a lot of cases either, if you're just playing mono green. Moving along, we have the commander that will allow you to do basically this. She is, I guess, the face of this video. Azusa, Lost But Seeking, 3 mana, including a single green, 1/2 human monk, and she says you may play 2 additional lands on each of your turns. So, for me, my Azusa deck is full of a lot of the cards on this video. In that deck, I want to play as many lands per turn, because Azusa says I can play a couple extra lands per turn. So I want several effects that do that, so that I can just keep playing more and more lands. And hopefully I have effects that will either draw me a ton of cards, or draw me cards when I play lands, or I have, things that'll fetch me lands, and then I have something that'll allow me to play lands out of my graveyard or whatever, so that I can, generate ramp / card advantage / filtering that way. But she is better than most everything else on this list in that she allows you to play 2 additional lands. So you get twice as much benefit off of her. Very good card. Just depends on how you use her, I guess. I don't know what else I could say, but if you are using her in the 99 and you have no other, I know that I've seen this in game nights, for instance, where someone got her out and then played 2 additional lands, and then after that she didn't do anything. So I think if you're playing her in that same way, and it could have just been that's how the deck happened to play out, or that next turn happened to play out, but if you're playing her in that way where you just hope to, maybe play a couple extra lands the turn she comes out, and then afterwards you never generate any more benefit, she's not worth including in the deck. You need more card advantage, more draw to where you can make sure that you are actually playing 3 lands per turn. If you've got that going, she's an amazing card that'll really help get you ahead. If not, that one-time effect, and then from there on you're not really doing anything with her, it's not worth including her. It's not worth the price. Even if she was a cheaper card, it wouldn't be worth including in a deck. Moving on are a few of the symmetrical effects. Rites of Flourishing, 3 mana, including a single green. Enchantment, at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card. And each player may play an additional land on each of his or her turns. So this one, I already included it in the card draw series because it draws cards. This time I will be including it in this series because it allows you to play an additional land. Now, it is a symmetrical effect. It affects you and your opponents equally. And this is true symmetry because you do not get any extra benefit over your opponents. It's not one of those symmetrical effects where if you build your deck a certain way, if it says all artifacts are blank and you're playing an artifact deck, then you benefit more than your opponents. This one is just, it's as symmetrical as it gets, as it's honest symmetry. The main reason that you would want to play this card is as a group hug card. I don't think that you would want to play it in a deck just for like your own card draw or your own ability to ramp, because you have so many other better ways to just draw or ramp yourself and actually generate real advantage for yourself. So yeah, either do it as a group hug thing, or if you just want to include as many effects like it where you play additional lands in a single deck. And I'll say that all of these cards are in my Azusa deck because even though it does, give my opponents benefit, I just want as many things that will allow me to play additional lands as possible in that deck. I care enough about that effect that it's needed to be included, or it's worth being included. But if you don't have a specific reason to, don't feel like you should be attached to this card. Get something else. Storm Cauldron, 5 mana. It's an artifact. During each player's turn, that player may put 1 additional land into play. Whenever a land is tapped for mana, return that land to owner's hand. So this is a card that can do some harmful things to a game. It's kind of like a Winter Orb in that it really can hurt people's abilities to use lands. Now, if you're playing a deck full of mana dorks or mana rocks, then you can kind of get around that downside. If you have lands that just tap for a ton of mana naturally, like each of your lands tap for 4 or 5 mana because you have things like, the Vernal Blooms and everything like that, then you don't need to tap as many lands to do your thing. So bouncing them to your hand is not a huge deal. This could easily be played for the oppressive effect if you're trying to hurt your opponents and make the game not fun. But like in my Azusa deck, it's just a way for me to play additional lands, and if I have to bounce my own lands to my hand, which does negatively affect me, that might be worth it because I have landfall triggers, and just being able to put the extra land into play helps. And if I have no lands in hand, I can tap a few lands for mana, even if I don't care about the mana. Even if I have no other cards in my hand to cast, I can tap them for mana, bounce them to my hand, then recast them or replay them and get those landfall triggers. And yeah, it's just really good if you want those landfall triggers. Great card if you play it right, or it can be very oppressive and mean and not fun if you play it right. So definitely something to consider whether or not you want that play experience before putting this in a deck. Then there's Ghirapur Orrery, 4 mana artifact. Each player may play an additional land on each of his or her turns, and at the beginning of each player's upkeep, if that player has no cards in hand, that player draws 3 cards. Now, I believe I mentioned this in my card draw series, and I said it's a terrible thing to include for yourself for those purposes, because why do you have no cards in your own hand? You should be including, if that's the case, if you expect to draw cards off of this because you have no cards in hand, you need more card draw effects and better ones that will actually draw you cards when you need it rather than this. So if you play this, it's far more likely that your opponents are going to get benefit off of the card draw aspect to it because you should have better card draw. If that's the case, you got to kind of wonder, is it worth it to potentially draw your hellbent opponent's cards? For me, in my Azusa deck, where I just want to play as many lands as possible and get those landfall triggers, yeah, I'm fine with that. Probably because I'm doing big things off of the play additional lands effect. Now, the play additional lands effect is symmetrical, so your opponents can do it too. But I'm going to have more lands in my deck, in that deck, and I am going to get extra benefit, the landfall triggers, every time I do play a land. So if you don't have any kind of synergy, playing additional land is symmetrical and it affects everybody equally. The card draw effect, if you built your deck right, won't benefit you very much often at all, but could benefit your opponents who didn't build their deck with very good card advantage. So this card, objectively, in most, if just thrown into a deck, is worse for you than any other card. It benefits your opponents more than it benefits you. If you want to include it for card draw, or I'm sorry, as a card in a group hug, it serves those purposes well, but you got to make sure that you actually have a good card draw engine going so that you hit that top ability, the ability to play extra lands, at the expense of the bottom ability where you know you'll never be drawing cards. So we're getting towards the end here, and there's just 3 outliers that are all, pretty good in some way or another, but don't necessarily match everything else. We'll start with Burgeoning. It's a single mana, it's green. It's an enchantment where whenever any opponent plays a land, you may choose a land card from your hand and put it into play. This one is obviously a very good card, sees a lot of play, and it's a great turn 1 play, especially if you go first, and especially if you have several lands in your hand, because it means that at the start of turn 2, you could have 4 lands in play, and then play your land for turn and have 5 lands into play. Which if you're a commander, costs 5 or less, get them out. Or if you have some other effect that'll draw you cards, like a Harmonize or anything, you can start really moving forward. Once you get to kind of the mid-game, when your opponents might be missing land drops, even if you got that huge card draw, a good card draw engine going, and you got 5, 6 extra lands in hand, and no max hand size, so you don't have to discard them, if 2 out of your 3 opponents aren't hitting their land drops, then you don't get to get any use out of this. Now, there are 2 things that are worth pointing out. It is when an opponent plays a land, so if they get extras in there thanks to like a Cultivate or Explosive Vegetation, this won't trigger off of that. And also, you are putting the land into play, so if you have any kind of landfall things that are like your creature gets +2/+2 till end of turn, you're not going to benefit off of it happening during an opponent's turn, or like a Lotus Cobra or something. So, yeah, just spreading your lands out does have a little bit of a negative effect, potentially sometimes in some small corner case ways. So that's what's worth pointing out with that. Next, Krosan Wayfarer, a single mana, it's green. It's a 1/1 Druid. Sacrifice it. Put a land card from your hand into play. Now, it's a 1 mana creature, so if you have, Guardian Project out and you're paying 1 mana and drawing a card off of it, and then you may choose to sacrifice this creature to put a land into play, I mean, you can actually get some pretty good value off of it. So there's that benefit. I generally don't like sacrificing my creatures for things, but in, the right deck that cares about sacrifice, it's good. In a druid deck like Seton, it's amazing because it's a 1 mana creature that's a druid that I can tap for mana with Seton, or if at some point I need to, suppose I've already tapped him for a mana and I really need a mana and I have a land in my hand, I can sack him, put the land into play, and then keep my turn going. So he's very valuable in the right deck, and yeah, as a 1 mana creature, he can really do a lot for you if you've built around him, or if you've built a deck that he fits into very well. And then finally, there's Scaretiller, 4 mana. It's a 1/4 artifact creature scarecrow. Whenever it becomes tapped, choose one. You may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped, or return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So this one sees a good amount of play for a relatively new card. I know as a Scarecrow, it obviously fits in a Reaper King Scarecrow tribal deck. Otherwise, well, you could have various ways of tapping your creatures, maybe equipment or something that says, tap your creature and do this. And by doing that, you get to put a land from your hand into the battlefield tapped, or get one from the graveyard. So maybe you already have synergies with tapping and untapping things, and you can keep doing that over and over. Maybe you have something that puts your lands into your graveyard, especially like a black deck, a Gitrog deck, a Titania. This is a good way to get those back from the graveyard onto the battlefield. And then maybe you have other landfall triggers. Personally, I only use it in my Reaper King Scarecrow deck because it's a Scarecrow. So I care more about its creature type rather than its ability. But it does have... it's similar to the other things that tap to get you a land, but he doesn't just get you a land from your hand. He can also get it from your graveyard. And if you do put it from your hand, he, unlike all the other creatures on this video, he puts it into play tapped. So it's not like you just get an extra land and ramp that way, like where you can use it right away that turn. So he is definitely an outlier compared to a lot of the other things. Also, the other things, like the Walking Atlas, the Skyshroud Ranger, the Llanowar, all those, they have the ability to just tap to do the thing with the land. He has to become tapped in some other way, whether it's attacking, or if you have an equipment or something that says tap a creature. So him, you have to work a little bit harder to even get the effect. With that, I think that kind of wraps up this series of this video of putting into play extra lands, and I should be back soon for the last couple of videos of this series. Thank you.